Thank you, Melissa. Let us pray. God of all creation, we stop for a brief moment to say thank you for your blessings upon this meeting, upon us, and this great nation for which we live. We are at this 2016 Governor's Conference to better understand the development and issues facing our changing industry, neighborhood, and communities. Grant unto us wisdom and insight. Show us how to develop partnerships in developing affordable housing for veterans, for people with disabilities, and the homeless. Help us to develop self-sustaining communities, a place to live, work, play, and worship. We ask this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Good afternoon. I hope all of you are finding this year's Housing and Economic Development Conference to be informative and productive. As Chief Executive Officer of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, I am pleased to be here today as we build on today and invest on tomorrow. I first want to thank all of our key sponsors. Without their support and assistance, this conference would not be possible. And the list of the sponsors are located at the board over there. I also must recognize all of the partners involved. You have worked so hard to coordinate this conference. Thank you to the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs, the New Jersey Housing and Mortgage Finance Agency, the New Jersey Affordable Housing Management Association, the New Jersey Development Corporation, and the staff at the Economic Development Authority. As Governor Christie remarked in his welcome letter, this year's 20th anniversary conference celebrates 2 decades of economic growth, resulting in the creation of jobs and high-quality development in communities across the state. From the vibrant, eclectic urban centers of northern New Jersey to the southernmost coastal resort towns for which the state is famous. New Jersey's diverse and thriving communities are why this conference is designed around economic development, offering sessions on such topics as creating downtowns, spurring transit-oriented growth, and creative mixed-use projects. The speakers and session topics for this year's conference were designed to bring you up-to-the-minute developments in those areas, including building accommodations for tenants with disabilities, creating affordable housing for the homeless, location, 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 showing how development projects along transit corridors can stimulate broader economic growth, and updates on low-income housing tax credits from a national and statewide perspective, and much more. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing this year's keynote speaker, Lance Freeman. Lance Freeman is a professor and director of the Urban Planning Program at Columbia University in New York City. His research focuses on affordable housing, gentrification, ethnic and racial stratification in housing markets, and the relationship between the built environment and well-being. Dr. Freeman teaches courses on community development, housing policy, and research methods. He also taught at the School of Urban Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Delaware. Prior to this, Dr. Freeman worked as a researcher at Mathematical Policy Research, a leading social policy research firm in Washington, D.C. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Freeman has published several articles on a range of issues, from neighborhood change and urban poverty to housing policy and urban sprawl. Dr. Freeman is also the author of There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up. He obtained extensive experience working with community development groups as a community development coordinator for the North Carolina Institute of Minority Economic Development and as a research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies in Chapel Hill. Dr. Freeman also has professional experience working as a city planner for New York City and as a budget analyst for the City Department of Environmental Protection. Without further delay, let us give a warm welcome for Dr. Freeman.
Hello, thanks, Melissa, for that kind introduction. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all here this afternoon. I'm really excited. I'm always happy when I have an opportunity to talk about something that I'm very passionate about. And today what I'm going to talk about is the topic of gentrification. I'm going to talk about what it is, why it's happening, and what we can do about it. Myself, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in New York, came of age in New York City during the 1980s. And I got interested in this topic because while I was growing up in New York, it was pretty much on the heels of the fiscal crisis. The city was sort of at its nadir in terms of attracting investment, in terms of crime. The crack epidemic was wreaking havoc on many communities. And I went away to graduate school and came back during the 1990s, and I started to notice some really significant changes. Neighborhoods like Harlem, for example, which is where my parents grew up. They were part of that great migration that came to New York City during the 1940s and 1950s. The neighborhood was changing dramatically, and I wanted to understand what was happening. And that's how I got interested in this topic. And so what I'm going to do today is just share with you some of my research and some of my thoughts on the topic of gentrification, and perhaps most importantly, think about what we can do about it. I don't think I have to tell you that gentrification is a very contentious and controversial topic, so I hope what you'll take away from my remarks today is a way of thinking about it in a way that's less divisive, as a way of bringing people together and creating a win-win circumstance. So what is gentrification? Well, here's one definition, described as a process by which poor inner city neighborhoods that have undergone disinvestments and economic decline experience a reversal, reinvestment, and the in-migration of a relatively well-off middle and upper class population. It also oftentimes has a racial composition to it, in that it entails whites moving into predominantly minority, that is Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And that's because in our urban cores, poor neighborhoods tend to be disproportionately, predominantly Black or Hispanic. I'm going to share with you a few scenes of gentrification. Many of you are probably familiar with places like Hoboken. This is sort of a classic case of gentrification, a refurbished row of brownstones. That's sort of the classic view of gentrification that we first came to think about when gentrification became a recurring theme during the 1970s and 1980s. But more recently, we're starting to see gentrification in the form of new development, right? Where developers are actually building market rate and luxury housing units in neighborhoods that were formerly working class or poor. Here's an example in Jersey City. Here's another example of new build development proposed in Newark, New Jersey, right? A city that experienced significant decline in the wake of urban unrest during the 1960s, and now we're starting to see a reversal, okay? And if we think about where it's happening, this is a map of Camden County, New Jersey, and if you can make out the red, orange, and yellow neighborhoods, those are places that are experiencing a significant influx of middle-class white residents, okay? In a city like Camden, which is perhaps surprising. It's also happening in Newark, in Essex County, and Hudson County. You can see neighborhoods along the Hudson River, neighborhoods close to the inner core of Newark are experiencing an influx of middle-class and wealthy white households. And the same is happening in Latino neighborhoods as well. Again, along the Hudson River, along the waterfront, and close to the inner core of Newark, you're seeing predominantly minority neighborhoods experiencing significant influx of middle-class whites. So that's what gentrification is. Those are some places where it's happening. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about why it's happening now. And sort of to set the stage for that, I think we need to recall what created inner city decline in the first place. during the middle decades of the 20th century. This was the period when the country was going through rapid suburbanization. It was during the time when we had significant white flight from many older central city neighborhoods. It was also during this time that deindustrialization started, when many manufacturing jobs left or moved to the Sun Belt or were automated. And at this time, we had a significant in-migration of relatively poorer African Americans and Latinos from Latin America. So that set the stage for what most of you are probably well familiar with, urban decline that came to characterize cities in New Jersey like Newark, Paterson, Camden, and cities around the country. I mentioned New York City, for example, other places, Baltimore, Detroit, and the list goes on. But a number of things happened that started to set the seeds for changing this dynamic. One is demography. Right? People are marrying at a much later age now than they were a few decades ago. This chart shows trends in the age of first marriage throughout the 20th century. And what you can see is that people are marrying at an older age now than at any time in the 20th century. Combined with the decline in fertility rates, this chart shows the decline in fertility since about the middle of the 20th century. And what you have is an increased population of young adults without children, for whom the suburban amenity package of a backyard, good schools, and the like is no longer so attractive, right? So you have young adults for whom living in the city is the preferred type of environment that they want to live in. So I think those trends are two very important factors that have driven the gentrification that we're seeing in a number of communities. There also have been significant changes in the local economy. So I mentioned that many cities were experiencing deindustrialization starting around the 1950s after World War II and picking up and accelerating into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We are now in what might be called a post-industrial economy, whereby industries or the service sectors like fire, finance, insurance, real estate, which many of you I'm sure are involved in, high-tech, engineering, management consulting, and the like, these industries don't necessarily place a premium on having a lot of space available to expand. For them, face-to-face interaction, access to the central city is more important. And so what you're seeing in places like downtown Newark, for example, we saw it in New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., there's a lot of demand for central office space in contrast to development on suburban or exurban periphery, okay? And so people naturally want to work downtown and they want to be close to where jobs are as well. But there have been other changes as well, I think, that are important. There have been what we might call cultural or attitudinal changes. Again, during the middle of the 20th century, the central cities became synonymous with crime, deterioration, disinvestment. They were viewed as unattractive places. They were places of heavy industry. That's starting to change. There was also more racial animosity, I think it's fair to argue. Of course, which is not to say that we live in a perfect racial climate nowadays. But if you were to compare today to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, I think it's fair to say that racial animosity has declined significantly. And so racial residential segregation is declining, right? And there's more of a willingness for people to live amongst others who are not like themselves. And then there's also another attitudinal change in terms of what type of physical environment do people find attractive? Do they want to live someplace where they have to drive everywhere? Or do they prefer somewhere where they can commute using other modes of transit? So I'm going to share with you a couple of charts that just illustrate the changes among 25 to 30-year-olds in terms of their preferences for how they get around. So consider the decline in auto use in terms of the number of miles driven, which is the first set of bars on the chart, and then the number of daily auto trips as well. So you see that slowly over time, in the past 2 decades, there's been a decline. Younger people are driving less than they were decades ago. The flip side of that is that people, younger people in particular, are using transit and are walking or biking more frequently. And you would find a similar pattern for other age groups as well. I just focused on this in the interest of time. And so what you're seeing is that people are having a preference for other options besides just having to drive everywhere. People want to live somewhere where they can walk, where there is an option to bike and the like. And that's more likely to be found in older neighborhoods that were built up before the automobile became the predominant mode of transportation in the middle of the 20th century. And then finally, there's also been a decline in crime. Again, if you listen to the media, it may not seem to be that case when all these fears about terrorism and the shootings of unarmed citizens and killing of police officers and the like, but make no mistake about it, crime is significantly lower. This chart shows a change in the homicide rate across the 20th century than it has been at any time since the middle of the 20th century, since the 1940s and 1950s. And again, it was during the 1960s and 70s that cities, urban centers, became viewed as very dangerous places. And so this significant decline in crime, I think, is making people feel safer. I know when I returned to New York City after going to school in North Carolina, the city seemed a lot safer. And you could see it in terms of people walking around in neighborhoods that a few years ago they would not have thought about walking around in. So I think that's another significant change that has happened. And I think the confluence of these factors, the changes in the demographics of the population, marrying later, fewer children, the changes in the economy, less manufacturing, more automation, more service sector jobs that place a premium on face-to-face interactions and being close to the center city, the changes in people's preferences in terms of the physical fabric of the type of neighborhood they want to live in, a place where they can walk around or bike and the like, increased racial tolerance, increased tolerance for diversity, and the decline in crime. I think those confluence of factors have reversed a decades-long trend of disinvestment. And so that's why we're seeing gentrification, perhaps unprecedented levels of gentrification in many cities, such as the few that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of my talk. And you're seeing it around the country in other cities as well. So that raises the questions of what we should do about it. So far, it might seem like gentrification is a great thing, right? If you think about the factors that were associated with inner city decline, the loss of population, the shriveling of the tax base, the exacerbation of segregation and poverty concentration, property abandonment, and the like, gentrification as a type of neighborhood change reverses these trends, right? And so you might say, well, what's not to like about it? It seems like a panacea for urban ills. Only a few decades ago, the urban problem or the urban crisis was something. I myself studied urban planning when I was in school, and the urban crisis was front and center in terms of when we thought about cities. Gentrification might seem to be the solution to our ills. However, I'm going to share with you another couple of slides that show that not everyone agrees with that viewpoint. And these slides are just meant to highlight some of the sentiment you might find in neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification. So this is a slide in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a college town that's starting to experience gentrification. People are writing graffiti expressing their views of what's happening there. Here's another slide in a Latino neighborhood in Chicago that's undergoing gentrification. Again, an example of people in the community expressing some of their feelings. And even across the Atlantic Ocean in London, you see people expressing a great deal of antagonism towards the notion of gentrification, okay? And so these slides highlight some of the underlying sentiments about people, how some people feel about gentrification. And myself, when I had returned to New York City in the 1990s, and I was startled by the gentrification that was happening in long, disinvested neighborhoods like Harlem, I was aware that there was this other undercurrent of resentment. And so I wanted to know, well, how did people feel about it, right? I mean, on the one hand, We have older neighborhoods that have experienced significant disinvestment, redlining, and the like, and now we're starting to see new investment. But people are some people are not happy about it, okay? How do we explain what might seem to be this paradox? So one of the things I did, and this slide here just shows what happened, a view of gentrification in Newark. One of the things I came to the conclusion is that gentrification is a dirty word. And to uncover that, I looked at the issue of displacement, right? So one obvious cause for people feeling that gentrification is such a negative thing is that poor people are displaced. However, several studies suggest that disadvantaged residents are no more likely to move in gentrifying neighborhoods than in other poor neighborhoods. In fact, what you find is that people in poor neighborhoods tend to move quite a bit across the board, whether or not they're in gentrifying neighborhoods or just another poor neighborhood. You do see that, not surprisingly, more affluent households are more likely to move into gentrifying neighborhoods. But in terms of poor people moving out more quickly, that's not what the evidence suggests, which I was actually surprised to find. You don't really see poor people leaving en masse when gentrification starts in poor neighborhoods. So it seems that the case is that poor people actually stay in gentrifying neighborhoods. There's an increased desire to stay put in neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification. And I think the answer to the question that I raised about why gentrification is such a dirty word is that it's not just about displacement in terms of physical displacement. And I'll share with you a few slides to get to that point. It's about feeling like they're being pushed out beyond just being physically evicted from their housing. So to answer this question, I did some research for my book, There Goes the Hood, where I focused on 2 neighborhoods in New York City. But I think the results, although it focused on New York City, would be similar to what you would find in other communities that are experiencing gentrification as well. And in general, what I found is that gentrification is viewed almost as a double-edged sword. And so as you'll see in a few minutes, many people felt positively about gentrification. These are people who were living in the community, had been there for years, gentrification was happening, then their incomes, and so that they're being priced out simply because the property taxes are becoming too expensive. And in a high tax, property tax state like New Jersey, that could potentially be very important. There are other subsidies. Inclusionary zoning is another example. The advantage of that is that new development happening in a gentrifying neighborhood would also set aside some units for low-income households, right? And you can use things like density bonuses to offset the increased costs and the like. The low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, could also be modified. We could decide to set aside credits or provide preferences or incentive bonuses to do development in neighborhoods where housing prices are rising very rapidly. We could also do the same thing with the voucher program. Again, housing vouchers are designed to be used throughout a metropolitan area. We might want to set aside some or target some for people living in neighborhoods where housing prices are rising very rapidly. Another idea I would put out there is tax increment financing as a way of setting aside increased property tax revenues for affordable housing. Again, this is not a novel idea, tax increment financing, but it's saying that if we focus the resources specifically on affordable housing in a neighborhood that is undergoing gentrification, right, you have a source of revenue, and you also are targeting it to people who are most vulnerable. This is a neighborhood where prices are rising more rapidly, perhaps in other parts of the city. So those are my ideas in terms of affordable housing. There are other ideas out there, but I think the key point that I would want to make in terms of affordable housing with regard to gentrification is that much of the affordable housing oftentimes doesn't necessarily target people who are in neighborhoods where gentrification is occurring. It's more targeted towards people in terms of their income, which I think is important, but we might also want to think about targeting it in a way in terms of allowing people who are in neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification to remain in that neighborhood as well. Is that a signal or something? I'm almost done, so. My last set of comments or suggestions would be dealing with the cynicism, right? So a few slides ago, I talked about how people felt like they were being pushed out of the neighborhood, even if they weren't physically, at risk of being evicted. They might have owned their home, or maybe they lived in subsidized housing. And I think, I'll just say briefly, I think the challenge is, and this is based on my observations in New York City, is when development occurs and when planning occurs, particularly if it's development that's not occurring as of right, I think it's important that people in the community have a say in what type of redevelopment is happening. And again, particularly if this is development that's not occurring as of right. And if you have a community that's interests are well represented, that is mobilized, where people feel like they have a say in what's happening in the community, I think, and this is again based on my observations and my experiences in New York City, I saw that people in those instances were not necessarily opposed to development, and they might not want to call it gentrification, they might want to call it something else. But my point is that people were not necessarily opposed to investment in their community or middle class folks moving into their community, but it was the way that the process unfolded, I think, that made people so cynical about the changes that they were observing. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think, again, as I started in the beginning, gentrification reverses some significant trends in disinvestment, but the downside to what might at first seem to be a panacea for urban ills is that many people feel like they're losing their home, they're losing their community. And it's not just about physical eviction, right? It's about people feeling like the neighborhood is changing, but the changes are not for them. It's for people who are coming into the neighborhood. And so this can, and sometimes could lead to people organizing and resisting redevelopment. The example I gave you in Portland is just one instance of that. And I think that type of outcome is the risk that we run if we don't address this and try to manage gentrification in a way that people who are living there feel like they have a say in the process, okay? So I would argue the goals would be to maintain diversity, right? Maintain mixed income neighborhoods. Gentrification is one way of doing that because you have more affluent households moving into relatively poor neighborhoods. We want to address people's fears of being pushed out and the cynicism that might lead to them resisting any type of redevelopment at all. And I think one way of doing that is to target affordable housing to these communities so people feel that any concerns they have about housing affordability are being addressed. And by mobilizing residents, and this is particularly important for people, those of you who work with community-based organizations or work for community development corporations, redevelopment is important, but just as important is developing the civic capacity, the social capital, and the mobilization of the residents in the community. And I think, ideally, if all that is done, gentrification doesn't have to necessarily be a dirty word. It can be a win-win both for residents of neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestment and for central cities in general. And again, I want to thank you for taking your time to listen to me, and enjoy the rest of your lunch.